Super, I'll just keep an eye on it. Hopefully you can hear me and you can see my screen. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by my colleague at Business Lincolnshire today, Paul Ward. Paul, are you there?
I'm here.
Hello.
Can you hear me okay?
I can certainly hear you. Thanks so much for reaching out to your contacts and inviting them today. It's much appreciated.
No problem.
Before I introduce myself, Paul, do you want to give a quick word to people who've joined about who you are and the kind of support that you're offering via Business Lincolnshire?
Yeah, no problem at all. So basically, I joined the Business Lincolnshire team as the Agric and Hortic advisor back in January. My role is really to reach out to agricultural, horticultural and food businesses in Greater Lincolnshire and Rutland, and I can cover any aspect from, general technical queries to COVID recovery, if you need help and support with the digital initiative or even automation, if you're looking at grants, or even innovation. Maybe you want to look at how your business is going in light of what's happened as a result of COVID and all the changes. And then obviously I've got strong links connecting me with the university. So if there's specific innovation that you're thinking of and maybe you need a bit of support, there's help there. And then even to things like marketing and digital information around that. As well as that, if the specifics on the EU exit in terms of export and import, I can help there and point you in the right direction of people like Andrea. And then specifics on such as pesticides, because obviously with us leaving the EU, we're now back into UK pesticide regulation. So it is different to the EU now, but certain things will apply post EU exit that are still relating to the EU rules. So for Northern Ireland, for example, stuff coming from Northern Ireland can still have EU pesticides on it, which may not necessarily comply with the UK requirements, but there's a dual scheme on the go at the minute. So if you need any help relating to a whole host of things in Ag and Hort, please do ask for help.
That's super. Thanks so much, Paul. And yes, that's super. So you've got the support from Paul and the wider Business Lincolnshire team. And then for those of you that don't know me, I'm Andrea Collins and our company is the Export Department. And we have been providing EU exit support across the East Midlands Growth Hub cluster pretty extensively now for the last 6 months. So our core business is export, but Brexit has kind of diverted our focus, as you can imagine, or EU exit, as we're meant to say now. So we've been delivering a number of topical webinars and also one-to-one support on behalf of Business Lincolnshire and the other 2 growth hubs. And it just struck us, having done work with some of the other growth hubs, so the Oxford, Cambridge ARC, that there are a number of food and drink manufacturers that are feeling the pain at the moment. So we were asked to put together some information for South East Midlands, and we just thought it would be good to share it with you guys today to hopefully you can gain something from the insight. So it is targeted at your sector, if you like, because we're all, it's not a traditional webinar today, we're all on more of a group meeting, then hopefully we'll have an interactive chat at the end, so you can unmute yourself and ask any questions, just letting somebody else in. Ask any questions you might have of Paul or myself, and just generally hopefully go away with a little more information than you came onto the call with today. Okay, so by means, hopefully you can all see my slides. By means of an introduction, so I'll just give you a very quick overview of the EU exit support programme that we're delivering on behalf of the growth hubs, but then we'll delve straight into the details. So we'll be talking about the implications of Brexit. We'll be talking specifically about the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and then we'll delve into the detail around food and drink sector, and particularly the kind of pain points that we're seeing amongst clients that we're supporting, so around product labelling and so on, and obviously the lack of both EU EU and the UK to strike a deal on equivalence for sanitary and phytosanitary standards is causing some pain, as I'm sure you all know. And then we'll touch on a little bit in terms of the future developments of the UK and EU negotiations, because they are still at the table. You know, we've had movement on GDPR, which wasn't sorted when we left, when the trade agreement was announced in December. And we're still waiting for further information on financial services and passporting rights. They're still very much at the table. And certainly we're hoping that there's some kind of middle ground met on the sanitary and phytosanitary standards moving forward as well. So not all is all said and done by any stretch of the imagination, so we'll touch on some of that. And then I've pulled together, as I always do with my presentations, just a slide or two at the back that signpost to sources of information and further advice. So yeah, there you go. So EU exit support programs, like I said, we've run a series of, well, we've now got 15 topical webinars that we'll have run. So obviously we've got a lot under our belt. We started running them back in September. But the ones that are up and coming, particularly that might be of interest to some of you on the call today, maybe the Origin one, which is coming up in April, perhaps the one towards the end of April as well, it touches on the new regulatory landscape. So yeah, you're very, very welcome to tap into those, and obviously Business Lincolnshire and the other growth hubs operate a number of different webinars on a whole raft of subjects, so there's a wealth of information there. But then in addition to the topical webinars, we also run the one-to-one support. So we have fact-finding sessions with you talking specifically about your business, and we go away and pull together a targeted action plan to address your burning issues, but also hopefully help you consider things that you might encounter in the future and that you should be thinking about or planning for now. Our SLAs aren't what they were. We've been slightly overwhelmed, so the action plans are taking a little bit longer to get out, but we're catching up. So any of you that feel that you would benefit from that very targeted, specific advice about your organisation with regard to EU exit, so import, export, regulation, and so on, then please feel free to book. I've given our Eventbrite link there. Also, as Paul said, he's got all of my details, so if you're having a chat with him and you think that you could benefit from speaking to us, then he'll make a referral on to us. So in terms of thinking about Brexit and the additional considerations that we have linked to our trade with the EU. So obviously, as importers and exporters, we've had to start understanding what documentary requirements apply to our products when they're either exported to the EU or imported from the EU. And that's been challenging for some companies that might only have exclusively traded within the EU. They're having to get their heads around import and export for the first time. Now, obviously, because of the phased implementation of import controls in the UK, then importers perhaps aren't feeling quite the same amount of pain as some of our exporters that have really had to get to grips with the EU's import controls pretty much from the 1st of January. And we're certainly seeing that there's quite substantial pain out there. Obviously, you know, we're now having to understand what processes are in place at the UK and EU borders, what kind of checks and inspections are applicable to our goods. On the import side of things, we're having to think about cash flow, because obviously in certain circumstances, duty may be payable to those goods coming from the EU. So under the terms of the EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, then goods of EU origin can come into the UK without any duty being payable. But should they be of alternative origin, then when they come into the UK, they face a duty, because obviously we've lost that free circulation of goods that we had as part of the EU. So cash flow can be impacted due to duty. And then obviously we have import VAT as well, which there are a couple of deferment mechanisms which aren't really the focus necessarily of today. But for those of you unaware, for import VAT, you can have authorization to use postponed VAT accounting. And obviously there's duty deferment accounts that can deal with the duty side of things as well. I should say duty deferment accounts can deal with VAT as well, but why you wouldn't want to look at postponed VAT accounting instead. So we've also had to become very familiar with the regulation governing our goods in those EU markets, because it's key to understanding the kind of documentation that needs to accompany our goods and what kind of physical or documentary examination might apply to our goods at the UK and EU border. Obviously, understanding if our goods are subject to any export or import licensing controls or certification, for example, like sanitary and phytosanitary certification. We're now having to think more seriously about the origin of our products when we're exporting to the EU. So identifying, we'll touch a lot on origin as we go through, but, identifying the raw material makeup and whether they meet the product specific rules within the Trade and Cooperation Agreement to be able to confer UK origin. A good source of advice on, if you're exporting beyond the EU as well, and you're wanting to know whether your goods can qualify for any preferential trade, if there's a free trade agreement in place between the UK and that export country, then the rules of origin database is very, very good. It basically takes all of the preferential trade agreements around the world and puts them in a database. So you can select where you're exporting to and the commodity code of your goods, and that will bring up whether there's a trade agreement. It'll display for you the origin protocol, so what rules your product needs to meet to be able to be determined as UK origin and therefore imported into that country under preference. And importantly, it'll also share with you the proof of origin that you need. So there's lots of different proof of origin that can accompany goods for your customer to be able to claim preference, or if you're the receiver of the goods, for you to be able to claim preference. So we've got statement on origin, we've got invoice declarations, we've got preference certificates. So you may be familiar with EUR1s, you may recall having heard of EUR1s. So that rules of origin database is very, very good for checking, because you're probably not all sad like me who does trail through the origin protocols and free trade agreements. We've obviously had to, or hopefully if we haven't, we should be doing now, we should be reaching out to our EU counterparts, whether they're our suppliers or our customers, and really having frank discussions around, the cost sensitivity of what we're doing and the disruptions that have been caused through delays at ports and so on, and those additional costs that we're facing around customs clearance and higher freight costs that we're seeing, globally at the moment. One thing Paul and I were discussing last week, actually, one thing that is coming out from doing so much client work at the moment is that we're imparting them with the best advice that we can so that they can take it back to their customers and suppliers in the EU, because what is becoming very, very evident is that our EU counterparts are no better prepared than we are, and they're feeling the pain. Perhaps not as much as we are in terms of their exporters, because we're not imposing the same level of controls on their goods coming into the UK yet, but there is pain there. And obviously, going back to that whole inflated cost, those duties and import VAT become applicable to those EU goods, or at least the import VAT does, entering the UK market, and that has impacts on affordability and also cash flow, as well as compliance issues around the valuation of those goods, because we're now having to value those imports, determine that dutiable value of those imports, the same way as we would have done on goods coming in from the rest of the world before the 1st of January. So that's a level of customs compliance to HMRC that we've not had to consider before. And then, we've also had to put our terms and conditions and our commercial agreements under much scrutiny and start thinking about Incoterms for the first time, because we've traded very informally with the EU in the past, and we haven't really worried about Incoterms. We've either made our goods available for them to collect, or we've delivered to their door. But now that those third country rules apply, we have to be a lot more robust in terms of our commercial agreements, and so those Incoterms are really quite important. They should be expressly stated in any kind of contract that we have, and they should also be stated on the commercial invoice. So in terms of how the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the much awaited Trade and Cooperation Agreement, affects particularly the food and drink business. So there are obviously a number of uncertainties for operators in that business at the moment, because they're looking at their products and they're grappling with the kind of paperwork and the whole new systems that are in around pre-notification and pre-authorization. They may be getting to grips with their commodity codes for the first time and understanding what tariffs will apply if they do. I mean, in terms of what was negotiated and much publicised when Johnson and Ursula von der Leyen announced the Trade and Cooperation Agreement on Christmas Eve, thinking it was some amazing Christmas present for everybody, was they basically announced it as zero tariffs and zero quota on goods. And I think a lot of people interpreted that as almost the equivalent of free circulation of goods, because we haven't had to worry about the kind of mechanisms of a free trade agreement with our EU neighbours before. So it's quite right, we have agreed to zero tariff and zero quota on goods, but to qualify for that tariff-free access, companies need to ensure the goods meet rules of origin requirements, and they're set out in a very extensively in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but they can be quite difficult to navigate if you've not had to do this before. So within the confines of that agreement, companies are having to look at the local qualification criteria. Obviously, it's a lot more burdensome than free circulation of goods, and it's understanding that, you know, yes, EU goods, that EU origin goods that come into the UK will come in tariff free, but if those goods are subsequently re-exported to the EU without any kind of processing happening in the UK to confer UK origin, or similarly without those goods having been suspended in something like a bonded warehouse, some kind of customs procedure or inward processing, when those goods go back out to the EU, they'll face a tariff. That's something that is completely different to how we've operated under free circulation of goods. So it's a lot for companies to get their heads around. So with the rules of origin, we did an awful lot of work with clients before Christmas. We had no idea what the origin protocols were going to be in the negotiated trade agreement, but we just had to work with clients to help them pull together essentially what is a bill of materials. So understanding the makeup of their finished goods and the origin of the ingredients, if you like. So, you know, for the purpose of food and drink, what's the origin of the individual ingredients? So we did a lot of work with clients around that, so that when the Trade and Cooperation Agreement was announced, we were able to consult the product-specific rules, so those kind of structures that we had to work within, and we had all of the background data done. So we were able to say, well, actually, yes, you know, all of the goods from that particular tariff heading are originating in the UK or in the EU, so, and we meet all of the other criteria, so therefore, yes, we can confer UK origin. But it was a lot of work to be done. And I suppose, you know, just for those of you not that familiar with origin, there are really two different ways of considering originating products. So you've got the notion of wholly obtained. You'll hear reference to wholly obtained, and that's goods that have been exclusively obtained or produced in the territory of one country without using any materials from another country. So, you know, the examples I often give are cattle or animals that have been, you know, born and raised in the UK or of UK origin, crops that have been sown and harvested in the UK or of UK origin, that kind of thing. But then you've also got the notion of substantially transformed or less substantial transformation, and that really applies to those goods that aren't wholly obtained because they contain goods from other countries, other non-originating material. But then importantly, the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, has a list of processes that, if they are carried out, are deemed to be insufficient processing to confer UK origin. So they actually trump the product specific rule. So even though you meet the product specific rule, if the processing that you're doing in the UK is on that list of being insufficient or too simplistic, then you cannot confer UK origin. So there is an example that I use of cheese being brought in from the EU. So we have the notion of bilateral cumulation in origin, so we can count EU originating goods as UK origin, which is great. It's not as good as maybe what we could have had, but it's some way there. So even if we import that cheese into the UK and the only processing we do on it is grating it, then when it's exported back to the EU, it will face a tariff because we haven't been able to do enough to it to confer UK origin. So there's some real subtle nuances in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that can be really quite difficult to navigate. So, you know, that's all stuff that that obviously we can help you with. In terms of customs and trade, so you know, the Trading Cooperation Agreement mandates customs declarations and paperwork in order to move goods from the EU to the UK and vice versa. It does recognise kind of trusted trader schemes. So the authorized economic operator status, AEO, some of you might be familiar with it. It's kind of like a kite mark trusted trader scheme. We recognize some of those standards across the EU and the UK, and that can lead to a certain level of easement of border controls. But it's not going to overcome the likes of the sanitary and phytosanitary border checks that are required for those, you know, those live animals and products of animal origin and plant-based products. So it means that those agri-food traders are met with additional costs and burdens. And those SPS checks, as we call them, or SPS border controls, have pretty extensive checks and specialised paperwork, so phytosanitary certificates, export health certificates, as you know, and frequent inspections throughout the kind of transit of the goods, if you like. Now, the TCA does include a very small bit of verbiage that says that the implementation of these SPS checks will be carefully monitored. And so they are monitoring the implementation. And as I say, the EU isn't feeling the pain that we're feeling at the moment. And there is a special committee that's been set up, which is the Trade Specialised Committee on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures, to see if any further facilitations are available without compromising that biosecurity. So those of you that aren't familiar with the border operating model that was announced back last year, that lays out the UK's approach to border control, and also explains, you know, the processes that we have to go through to export goods to the EU, then I would suggest that you familiarise yourself with it. It has some very good process flows that I'm going to share with you later on in the presentation, that shows you exactly what needs to be done pre-export, pre-import, and, you know, all the systems that are involved, and then what the customer or you know, the EU counterpart is doing from their side of things. In terms of those you know, we had that phased implementation of import controls. So they have actually, you might have read in the news that there's been further delays, and we've caused quite a lot of upset from the EU, I think, on some of the announcements that have been made. But certainly the new extension on the import controls for sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So the checks that were meant to come in place on the 1st of April have been delayed until the 1st of October. So from the 1st of October, we'll start doing checks on agri-food and feed. So those products of animal origin and high-risk foods not of animal origin. And that documentation around export health certification and so on has been delayed from the 1st of April until the 1st of October. This is for goods coming into the UK, obviously. And also, those entry safety and security declarations for imports have been delayed from the 1st of July until the 1st of January. Import declarations are still required, but they can be deferred under the current system. So you'll remember with the phasing in of import controls, there was the option to defer making the declaration, and so therefore defer any duty and VAT and so on until the 1st of July. That's now been extended till the 1st of January. And there's pre-notification requirements and documentary checks and so on. Phytosanitary certificates have been delayed until January as well. And then those physical SPS checks on high-risk plants and agri-food and feed will take place at border control posts rather at the point of destination from the 1st of January as opposed to the 1st of July. So at the moment, it was planned that from the 1st of July, those inspections would take place at these border control posts around the UK. And I think the truth is we're just not geared up for it yet. So they've delayed that until the 1st of January. And then checks on live animals and low risk plants at those border control posts have been delayed until March 2022. So I appreciate I've gone through a lot there. Quite happy to send out an email afterwards with those exact timelines, or Paul has the information as well that I'm sure he'd be happy to share with you. We've also got conformity assessments as well. So there's really a limited mutual recognition of conformity assessment. So most goods are having to go through 2 sets of conformity assessment if they're going to be placed on both the GB and the Northern Ireland / EU market. So some regulated sectors, including organics and wine and the food sector, have been granted streamlined conformity assessments, but the rest haven't been. So wine in particular within the TCA contains specific facilitations for the trade in wine. So producers can now self-certify conformity in the quality of their wine. So those common principles on labelling apply, and both the UK and the EU have committed to mutually recognise wines produced according to each other's rules, as long as they remain in line with the recommendations by the International Organisation of the Vine and Wine. So there's been some easements for wine and also organics. So this was good news. The TCA outlined equivalents on organic rules for all categories of organic produce, which was great news. So organic products complying with EU law and certified by controlled bodies recognised by the EU are accepted in the UK market and vice versa. So that equivalence decision will be reviewed at the end of 2023, and I think that's the difference with equivalence. We see it with a lot of sectors where both parties agree to recognise each other's standards. So we see it in digital services, we see it in financial services, or that's the mechanism we're going to go to. But it's not the same as when we were part of the single market and we were all abiding by the same set of regulation, because that equivalence, when it's been agreed, it's typically for a finite period and it can be withdrawn within 30 days notice. So the fact that we have equivalence on organic standards and it will be reviewed at the end of 2023, it could similarly be withdrawn within 30 days notice. So it creates a level of uncertainty for business operators in that particular sector. Now, in terms of how Brexit indirectly impacts the food and drink sector, so obviously, thinking about the shortfall of workers and the loss of EU nationals. So, we estimate something like 130,000 of the 400,000 strong food and drink manufacturing workforce are non-UK nationals, many from Eastern Europe. So we could see a reduction in terms of, the number of those people able to enter the UK. And we know that a number of them have already gone home. And it does seem on face value that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement favours the inflow of skilled workers rather than lower skilled workers, which is a real shame considering, how much these individuals have added to the UK economy. And obviously we've moved from free movement of people to the UK points-based immigration system, which requires you as a business to become a sponsor to hire somebody from outside of the UK. And obviously there's a cost associated with that and a timescale involved. So it's completely changed the way that we can hire people from outside of the UK. Also loss of farming subsidies. So the impact on the UK's agricultural sector, obviously through a potential loss of farming subsidies, could happen. Manufacturers could become impacted by availability of ingredients that could in turn give way to cheaper imports from other countries. Now, obviously the UK government has mechanisms in place to prevent anti-dumping. They can protect certain sectors from an influx of cheaper goods, and they have retained the ability to do that. So if the EU all of a sudden wanted to flood our market with cheaper goods into, say, the agricultural sector, then the UK government could act. They're able to act under the terms of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, because that would be creating an unlevel playing field, if you like. But a lot of companies, including companies in the food and drink sector, are already being hit by not just EU exit, but also by COVID. So we're seeing dramatically inflated transport costs, specifically from China, actually, and Thailand. We have a client who imports tapioca starch from Thailand, and they're seeing, shipment costs of 5 and 6 times what they were pre-COVID level, which has a devastating impact on margin. And obviously that will settle down over time. And I'm pretty confident with Brexit as well that we'll find our feet. We have to be very pragmatic and think this is a new trading landscape. What can we do to make the best of it? Non-tariff barriers to export, we'll talk about in a second, but obviously that regulatory divergence is a concern as well. So, there's things around health and safety, consumer protection, climate change and the environment and everything. Obviously, both parties have set out in the TCA that they are committed to staying regulatory aligned in a number of areas around those issues, and that are mechanisms in place to address any deviations. So you'll have heard them talking about rebalancing measures. So if the UK decides to go off in one direction, the EU can all of a sudden impose a whole load of tariffs, and vice versa. We have the same power to do the same to them. So there's no appetite on either side to dramatically diverge in terms of regulation. But longer term regulation divergence has to be a consideration and has to be in a risk register somewhere for a company, is something that they should be thinking about longer term. So I just pulled together a couple of stats on the food and drink sector for my own learning, actually, a couple of months ago, and was just, you know, ever staggered to see the contribution that that the sector makes to the overall UK economy. Certainly we're based in Swindon, so in the southwest, and we have a very thriving food and drink sector, and some amazing businesses that are, you know, doing their best to survive in what has been a really challenging climate over the last, what are we now, getting on for 15 months, I think, really. But you'll get a copy of the slides so you can go through these, and I'm sure you understand your sectors better than I ever could. I just pulled some stuff together on labelling, so, you know, the kind of requirements that exist already around food labelling. So, you know, the talking specifically about the labelling of packaged goods, so, you know, the need for best before and use by date and so on, and importantly the name and address of the food business operator, and I'll come on to that in a second, because there have been changes in line with the EU exit around that, and obviously mandatory things around alcoholic strength by volume and so on. And, you know, it's these kind of things that over time we could see changing slightly. And the challenge, and I think Paul alluded to it earlier as well in his introduction, is we're now having to, when we were all part of one single market, we were abiding by EU regulation. Now we're a separate market, and it's just Great Britain as well. We'll come on to the Northern Ireland Protocol in a second. So, you know, Great Britain has different regulations to abide by, and quite often different regulatory bodies to report to than the EU does. So if we're placing products on both the UK market, sorry, not the UK market, the GB market, and similarly, if we're placing products on the EU/Northern Ireland market, we have different things to consider. And that, for small businesses and micro businesses, has added a layer of, you know, complexity that they didn't have to think about before. So just pulled together a couple of things there that kind of set the scene. So talking about product labelling in particular, and starting off with food business operator. So EU exit has had several implications for food labelling. And like I said, we'll go through some of them now, but just starting with food business operator, or the FBO. So those pre-packed foods sold in the EU27 as they are now have to include the name, an EU/NI address, Northern Ireland address, on the label of either the responsible food business operator or the importer established in the EU27 or Northern Ireland. So an address in GB alone is no longer sufficient for the food business operator for goods going into the EU. Similarly, product placed on the GB market must have a GB address, but the difference here is that, as with many regulatory requirements, the EU is instant. We've had to basically conform immediately, but the UK government has the power to introduce implementation periods. So they've done exactly this. So you can continue to use an EU GB or NI address for a product sold in GB until the 30th of September next year, so 30th of September 2022. But from the 1st of October, those pre-packaged foods have to carry the GB food business operator address. And it's quite simple. You know, the UK government wanted to give food business operators the opportunity to work through existing labelling stocks and not put more cost burden on them. Important, though, that those pre-packaged foods sold in Northern Ireland have to include an FBO address of either a Northern Ireland operator or an EU operator, because in line with the Northern Ireland Protocol, Northern Ireland remains closely regulatory aligned with the EU. So probably closer in terms of operating to the EU than it is to GB. For GB, a label that carries both addresses, so the one of the EU food business operator and the GB one, is permitted. But understanding what the EU requires, they're quite specific around what qualifies as a food business operator's address, and they're quite specific that a PO address won't do it. It has to be a physical location, if you like. So that's something that we've had to get our heads around, and certainly some of the clients that we have been supporting up to the run at Christmas and then beyond have been reaching out to their importers in the EU and having them operate as the food business operators to fulfil that regulatory requirement. In terms of the equivalency on organic foods, so that, as I say, came as quite a relief, because we export in excess of £250 million worth of organic foods into the EU every year. So the EU is actually recognising the 6 organic certification schemes that are operating in the UK, and again, like I said earlier, this will be reviewed at the end of December 2023. Recognition by the EU of the UK's organic sector obviously will ensure our continued vital access to the Northern Ireland market, and it does bring a level of certainty at least for the next however many months before the end of 2023. But the problem is, outside of the TCA, Brexit does affect the export of organic products beyond the EU, because we've automatically dropped out of a number of the equivalency agreements that we had when we were part of the EU. So really, those of you that are involved in the export of organic products, it's best to reach out to your body and understand, your certification body, and understand what's the latest status and advice on organic certification for the markets that you're looking to export to. As I said before, that just about equivalence, it's granted for a finite period of time, but can be withdrawn with very little notice. But essentially it works very different to how we've worked in the past, where we've had a country of origin principle, where so long as we were abiding by the rules set by the UK government, we could sell our products anywhere within the EU with that country of origin principle. And now that's been replaced by equivalent and passporting and so on. So big changes ahead for many sectors, not just the food and drink. In terms of geographical indications, or GIs, those of you will know that they refer to food, drink and agricultural products that have that geographical connection, or they're made using traditional methods. Obviously, they can be registered and protected as intellectual property, so they're different to trademarks. So whereas a trademark belongs to the business that registers the product or the brand for protection, but that GI protection guarantees the product's characteristics or reputation and its authenticity of origin and so on, and it protects the product name from misuse or imitation. Now, the EU has always managed these geographical indicators, but the GIs have actually been registered and are now protected under a UK scheme. So the UK has developed its own geographical indicator protection scheme, if you like. So moving forward, all existing UK products that were registered under the EU GI scheme, that were registered before the end of the transition, are now protected in the UK under the UK GI scheme. If you're a producer or a retailer of an agri-food GI product in GB and have registered before the end of the transition period, you'll have until the 1st of January 2024 to adopt the relevant UK logo. So again, it's around that product packaging. You're not having to automatically adapt your packaging to show the new UK GI logo. You've got that period of time up until the 1st of January 2024. So if you think about it moving forward, it's another example of how we're operating two schemes. So EU GI scheme will continue to protect registered products when they're sold in the EU and importantly into Northern Ireland. And if you're placing product on the EU marketplace and also the UK market, and you might want to use the EU GI, then you'd have to have you'd have to be part of the UK GI scheme before you could access the EU GI scheme. Sounds very complicated. With respect to third countries, because obviously, just as I said with organics and equivalents there, we're having to renegotiate these kind of, recognition and protection of GIs with those third countries, so countries outside of the EU. So obviously the UK has signed a number of continuity agreements and a couple of free trade agreements, most notably Japan and Singapore. But that protection of UK GIs has to form part of those agreements, so that we know when they can be used when we're exporting goods and placing goods on those export markets. In terms of country of origin labelling, so food from Northern Ireland can continue to use origin EU. Food from GB mustn't be labelled as origin EU from now, basically, so from the 1st of January. For GB and Northern Ireland labelling, so food from and sold in Northern Ireland can continue to use origin EU from the 1st of January, but food from and sold in GB can be labelled as origin EU until the 30th of September 2022, so again to exhaust those labelling stocks. But from the 1st of October, that food from GB must not be labelled as EU origin, okay, when it's sold in the GB or Northern Ireland marketplace. So things to think about there. Also impacts on health and identification marking. So for the EU and Northern Ireland, products of animal origin moved into the EU and Northern Ireland markets from GB now requires relabelling to meet the requirements. So GB and non-EU markets, so those products of animal origin that have been placed on the market in GB after the 1st of January can reach the end user in the non-EU market without the need for relabelling. So that's been good while we can, get through existing stocks. Again, just to try and phase in the changes and alleviate the pressures on companies, then as I said earlier, the UK government has announced this phasing in of labelling, so we can actually over-label our goods in certain circumstances. But this is really quite important in terms of the origin of these goods. As I say, I'd set out originally in this presentation, when I was first delivering it, that there was a 3-month grace period for authorised traders moving products of animal origin or composite products or food and feed. And there was another 6-month arrangement. All of these, as I said earlier, have been unilaterally extended to be phased in from October 2021, as mentioned. So the government has been really clear. This comes up a lot when people are talking about new compliance and so on, and what does the government do if I get it wrong or whatever. The UK government has been certainly clear since back at the end of 2020 that any relevant enforcement agencies or authorities should adopt a really proportionate and risk-based enforcement approach for identification marks and other labelling things, because they appreciate that it's a really stressful time for food business operators and they're grappling with the new way of working. So in terms of labelling, I've provided a couple of examples here on the slide. So products of animal origin produced in Great Britain, so England, Scotland and Wales, the EC suffix is removed from those health and identification marks, and the marks carry the full country name United Kingdom or an abbreviated code of GB or UK. And then for products of animal origin produced in Northern Ireland, that health and identification mark can continue to use the EC suffix, but the mark has to carry the full country name of United Kingdom, Northern Ireland or UK in brackets NI. So where possible, the UK asks us to use the full country code of United Kingdom, but quite often this can depend on, the amount of packaging space that you've got, and there's very strict rules around the size of the health and identification mark, and it can't be too small or too large. Obviously, exemption for eggs for human consumption and hatching, so they are not subjected to the health and identification mark, but they are subjected sometimes to the ISO code. Okay, marching swiftly on because I'm conscious we're not doing that well for time at the moment. In terms of additional considerations, so the EU emblem, so British produced foods can obviously no longer use the EU emblem, so the stars on a blue background, and must instead use the British emblem. But again, we've got until the 30th of September, at least in the UK, to start using that new emblem. In terms of the organic logo, so because we've got that equivalence, We can use the EU organic logo for goods being placed on the GB market and also on the EU and Northern Ireland market, but it's not compulsory, so you don't have to. If you do use the EU organic logo for exports to the EU, though, you'll have to include both the GB Statement of Agriculture and the EU Statement of Agriculture. So if you're using that emblem, then you have to include those two statements. But you can continue to use and reference your UK Organic Control Body as well. In terms of the impact of these sanitary and phytosanitary controls, so the UK and the EU are technically now maintaining two separate regimes regulating that human, plants and animal health. And so the trade and cooperation agreement essentially places a duty on both sides to make sure that any SPS controls are proportionate to the risks identified. And the EU has obviously taken a very strict approach to this from day one, whereas the UK has tried to ease everybody into this. Again, in terms of how the implementation is managed and how much pain is being caused on both sides of the channel, you've got this this specialist committee that's going to be reviewing the implementation. But again, you know, we're not seeing that the EU is feeling the pain that we are yet until we fully bring in those import controls. The deal also commits to ongoing cooperation on animal welfare and antimicrobial resistance and sustainable food systems. We've also been granted, the EU separately granted the UK what's called national listed status, so allowing trade of live animals and products of animal origin and plants, but as we know, there are those stringent controls. I suppose when you think about it, it's thinking about export on the wider scale. Outside of export licensing, those sanitary and phytosanitary border controls probably contain the most extensive checks. Obviously, very specialist paperwork, frequent physical inspections throughout before the goods depart, and sometimes as the goods are in transit, and then when they arrive at the other end. And whilst the TCA does set out a general aim to keep the frequency of checks to a minimum, it doesn't remove the need for them. And we haven't been able to agree a reduced level of checks or fees similar to like the EU-New Zealand vet agreement, where only 1% of goods are subject to SPS checks. I think the purpose for that is it would have required the UK to sign up to greater regulatory alignment with the EU, and that just wasn't palatable to the UK government. Johnson has made it very clear over the last year and a bit that, you know, he favours a more deregulated economy to that which we had under the EU. So that, you know, this lack of equivalence means that obviously agri-food businesses are incurring extra costs on that GB-EU trade. And you know, the costs associated with compliance are significant, on top of all of the other costs that we're incurring as a result of having to import and export for real to and from the EU. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to say on that. Probably not really. We can take some separate questions on that at the end. In terms of understanding origin, we talked a little bit. I just thought it'd be helpful if some of you are looking at the trade and cooperation agreement and trying to navigate origin rules for your own products. It might be good to go through some of the terminology and understand what it means. So originating status we've talked about, is whether those goods have been wholly obtained or they've been sufficiently worked or processed to confer UK origin. When you see reference to accumulation, that there's various different types of accumulation, and what's agreed in the trade and cooperation agreement is bilateral accumulation. So it says that, you know, EU manufacturers can use UK raw material to count as their origin goods, and we can do the same here, but just for the purposes of trade between the EU and the UK. That's bilateral accumulation. What the UK government wanted was diagonal accumulation or full accumulation, where we could have counted raw materials from outside of the EU as our origin for the purposes of trade with the EU. So we see it with our trade agreement with Israel. When we're selling goods into Israel and we're conferring UK origin, we can actually count EU raw material as part of our origin for the purposes of trading with Israel, because we've got a diagonal accumulation agreement with Israel. Product specific rules. are those rules that are assigned to each product in the tariff. So your product that you sell will have a product specific rule in the trade and cooperation agreement, and it will be a combination of, you know, if it's not wholly obtained and you need to demonstrate that you've done sufficient processing of the product, it will typically have either a change of tariff classification. So the finished goods has to have an entirely different tariff classification to all of the originating materials or ingredients. That might be one, but then it might give you the option of you don't have to change the tariff classification, but you're limited as to how much non-originating material you can have, which is goods that originate outside of the UK or the EU. And for the purposes of food and drink, that's typically by weight rather than by ex works value. And then there's minimal operations that I talked about earlier. In the trade and cooperation agreement, they're referred to as insufficient processing. So going back to that grated cheese example. The no drawback rule is an interesting one. So within the UK, we've got a number of customs special procedures that we can use to suspend the rate of duty and VAT that we pay on imported goods if they're coming in for manufacturing purposes, for example, so inward processing. So we could bring in goods from outside of the UK, not pay the duty and VAT on them, use them to manufacture finished goods, and then export those finished goods. Now, typically in other free trade agreements, where the country of origin has benefited from not having to pay any duty, then when the goods have been exported, then they've faced a tariff in the country, the other party to the trade agreement. That doesn't exist within the TCA. So even though we may have benefited from reduced duty in the UK, then at the same time, our EU counterparts or our EU customers don't have to pay duty as well. That's very different to how other EU trade agreements work. That direct transport rule, you might hear reference to it. So where we've said that goods are of a certain origin, we need to make sure that if they've been transported to the country of destination, that they're not fiddled with in any way, or that their origin isn't changed in any way. So quite often, if they've stopped over in a third country that's not party to that trade agreement, then you might have to provide some kind of customs documentation to say that the goods stayed within customs control and that, you know, they weren't impacted or they weren't affected in any other way. And proof of origin is obviously, as we know, when you're importing under preference, because you're importing goods that are of a certain origin and therefore you can import them without paying any duty or VAT, then you need to be able to provide customs with proof. So for the purposes of the trade and cooperation agreement, if we're bringing goods in from the EU, we need to have either enough knowledge, so our importers' knowledge, to say, yes, we're declaring them to be of EU origin because we've got all of this material, we've got bills of material and all sorts of stuff, so we know, and we could produce that if customs wanted us to. Or alternatively, our EU supplier has to make a statement on origin on their commercial invoice. So on their commercial invoice, on their packing note, whatever, but not on their bill of lading. So that's it. And similarly, if you're exporting goods, so you would have to make that statement on origin if the goods were of UK origin, and you'd have to maintain your bill of material and all of the proof that went into determining that your goods were of UK origin. You need to maintain that for 4 years because customs could ask to inspect it at any time. And similarly, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement has this this level of cooperation, if you like, between two parties, whereby each customs authority can come to the other for specific information. So if French customs wanted information from an importer in France and they couldn't provide it, French customs could come to HMRC and ask them to contact you as the exporter. So maintaining that paperwork is really, really important. I'm rushing through here, folks. So the impact of tariffs and origins. So obviously, it is true we have no tariffs, we have no quotas for those qualifying products, so those EU origin goods coming into the UK and for those UK origin goods going into the EU. it is unlike any other European free trade agreement. It is a lot more ambitious in certain places. I don't think it's ambitious, particularly in the food and drink environment at all. In fact, I think it's quite restrictive. But in other sectors, we're seeing that it is more ambitious than the likes of their trade agreement with Canada and Japan and so on. Again, you know, for that tariff-free access, then those goods must be either wholly obtained or sufficiently transformed. And that transparency, or that traceability of origin, has to flow through the supply chain. So those bill of materials become really, really important. And that paperwork that backs up your determining the origin of your goods must be maintained for that 4 years as an exporter, and for the importer, they'll have to maintain it for 3 years. And again, like I said, we've got that bilateral accumulation, which was welcomed, but certainly wasn't as ambitious as the UK government wanted. And it does make it quite restrictive in terms of how we export our goods moving forward, because if we can't strike equivalent deals to the one we've got with Israel, where we can use EU raw material for the purpose of UK origin, then some goods are going to struggle to be able to say they're of UK origin, and therefore they won't be able to be imported into the export market without any duty. I've just given here, and because I'm going to get you the slides, I am not going to go through this in much detail in the interest of time, but I've given you some examples here on wholly obtained examples, and then also on sufficiently transformed examples. So these particular examples are deemed to be sufficiently transformed, and therefore they could be conferred UK origin in the UK, and therefore would be imported into the EU without any tariff. The impact of non-tariff barriers. So obviously, you know, quite often over the last 4 years, we've been asked, what do you think the greatest impact of EU exit will be on companies? Oh, it's got to be the tariffs. Actually, it's not the tariffs. The tariffs are a small part of it. It's the non-tariff barriers. So as a lot of you guys might be experiencing already, it's those sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So it's those import and export controls. Obviously, you know, technical barriers that are placed on certain products by the market that you're exporting to. There's pre-shipment inspections and other formalities as well. So we see that a lot, not just with goods going into the EU, but also when we export to other countries. You know, every country and every trading bloc will have its own import controls and its own rules around conformity and so on. And quite often, you know, some markets, particularly the Arab League, will insist on pre-shipment inspections before those goods are actually leave the UK. Obviously, licenses we're seeing, so export licenses, you know, dual use, military goods, works of art and so on are all subject to licenses. Regulatory standards, as Paul alluded to, and I've said as well, in so many sectors now we've broken away from EU regulation, because that was one of the main reasons that people voted for Brexit, and we're now operating 2 different sets of regulatory bodies and standards, and that for truly you know, a company that deals with more than just its domestic market, that is a bit of a headache to get their heads around, and obviously monitoring the regulatory changes that come about. Impacts on post-sale service, we're seeing that a lot in other sectors, perhaps not so much with you guys, but certainly, you know, in the past it's been very easy for us to set up companies and so on in the EU to manage that after sales care and so on. That's not quite so simple anymore. Obviously, it's origin that determines whether our goods can be shipped to the EU without any duty, and that's very different to the free circulation of goods, where, you know, goods could be brought in from outside the EU into the UK. There might be duty to pay, there might be VAT to pay, but then once that's done and all of the customs control measures are taken care of, those goods can circulate freely within the remaining member states. That's very different to how we operate now. GDPR, that kind of goes away because we have reached at least a level of what we call adequacy, that the EU has confirmed that our data protection standards are adequate, and we just need to get that ruling through in time. Changes to VAT as well. So, you know, in the past on a B2B transaction, you would have exchanged VAT numbers with your supplier or your customer, and there's no actual VAT changes hands. It's accounted for via the reverse charge in the country that you know is receiving the goods. That has changed now in terms of import and export. So it's the time at which that VAT becomes payable that's changed. It's payable when the goods enter the country, which, as I said earlier, that can that can lead to cash flow issues if you've not got any deferment mechanism in place. And then the Northern Ireland Protocol has thrown a huge spanner in the works, which is probably quite pertinent to talk about that now, actually. So obviously it was a big part of the withdrawal agreement being signed, and it's far from ideal, and personally I don't know how it's going to work long term. It effectively creates a border down the Irish Sea instead of a border on the island of Ireland. So there's no impact on goods coming in from Northern Ireland to GB. You know, there's no controls, there's nothing. It's that unfettered access that Johnson and the government promised Northern Ireland. But for goods going from GB to Northern Ireland, it's a very different picture. And effectively from the 1st of January, all of those kind of agri-food goods and plants and animals entering Northern Ireland from GB were meant to be going through, you know, specific EU approved ports in Northern Ireland, and facing, you know, those sanitary and phytosanitary checks. Now we know that that the UK government has just changed in terms of the timeline, and quite happy to get those details out to you. But effectively, those sanitary and phytosanitary measures won't come into force until October, and even then it will be phased. So they've introduced, you know, phase 1 will be the introduction of export health certificates for fresh meat products. Phase 2 will be export health certificates for dairy products, as well as certificates for plant seeds and wine. So they have unilaterally, at huge annoyance of the EU, taken a very pragmatic decision to extend these easements, because they recognise that it's causing huge problems getting products from GB to Northern Ireland. I just want to touch on very, very quickly at-risk goods. So you might have heard it mentioned that goods can be qualified as being at risk. Essentially what that means is, if you imagine Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Protocol has placed Northern Ireland in a kind of hybrid model between the UK and the EU. So it's closely aligned to the EU for regulatory purposes, but it's still in the UK customs territory. So if we supply goods to Northern Ireland, then we don't charge duty, because we're as part of the same customs territory. However, if those goods are at risk of entering Ireland from Northern Ireland, then there's a duty to pay. So it's payable if the EU duty, as outlined in the EU Common External Tariff, is greater than 0, which is quite possible it will be. So a lot of goods will automatically qualify as being at risk. You can make a declaration, or the trader in Northern Ireland can make a declaration to say that you know, the goods aren't at risk because they're staying in Northern Ireland, and they use the UK Trader Scheme to do that. But where they can't guarantee that the goods aren't at risk, then that duty becomes payable at the Northern Ireland border with GB rather than within Ireland. So that's been a lot for traders to get their heads around as well, and the complexities and the, you know, how the Northern Ireland model is going to work long term. I just absolutely have no idea. I have given just a couple of examples here. I'm just very conscious of time. Those of you that do have to nip off the call, please feel free that you can. I will only take a couple more minutes and then we can take some questions. But I've just provided a couple of flows here. This is for export. So I love these illustrations because it shows kind of the importers and the exporters requirements to ship goods, but it also gives us visibility of the kind of systems that are at play and all of the different notifications and triggers that happen when we make an export or an import declaration. So you've got the C88 at the heart, and then there's lots of different systems that are are triggered depending on the fields that are completed in the import or export declaration. So for this one in particular, this is export. So you can see that the UK export has to source an official vet or an EHO, environmental health officer, who can certify the goods. A company that I come across quite frequently is Amivet, because they issue the health certificates for meat, dairy, food and animal products. The EU importer at the same time needs to check that they can import the goods from the UK, and if they're approved to do so. There's goods and documentation has to be routed through a border control post, so that's immediate for exports to the EU. Obviously, when we come on to imports in a second, it's not the case. If the goods aren't harmonised, then they might be subject to other requirements. So that's important to check. The UK exporter makes the export entry, and then the EU importer has to pre-notify using Traces, which is the EU's platform for sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So they make a pre-notification in the EU, and that will issue what we call a unique notifier number. And that unique notifier number needs to go on the export health certificate in the UK. So that's typically how it works. So there's kind of communication that's going backwards and forwards, and then obviously to get goods into the EU we're having to go through border inspection posts or border control posts, where they've got the manpower and the ability to do the kind of correct documentary, identity and physical checks of the goods. But then on the import side of things, so obviously this is an old illustration because this has now been put back quite substantially beyond the 1st of July. But it's a very similar process, but this time the importer is obviously a UK company, so they use IPAS, so the Imported Products, Animals, Food and Feed System in the UK rather than EU Traces, so we're no longer part of EU Traces. And then it's a very, very similar process, still obviously needing export health certificates from our EU supplier, if you like. So those process flows are really, really good. They're in the border operating model document that the government published. Really good. They provide them for a number of different sectors. I'll skirt through this because I'm not sure how much of it is massively important for you guys. I just wanted to talk very briefly at the end around grace periods. So obviously this has been extended now, as I've mentioned. UK exporters certifying origin, they've actually got 12 months grace period to to have all of the documentation around, to be able to demonstrate that they've got the documentation around certifying origin. GDPR is an interesting one, but not sure it really impacts you guys so much where you're processing EU personal data, but it was a big sticking point in the trade and cooperation agreement. The EU, it was very bureaucratic because we jumped through hoops to get to be GDPR compliant back in 2018, but as a third country the EU said that we had to meet their data adequacy levels, and it's been deemed now that we have. So we didn't in time for the trade and cooperation agreement coming out, but we have now. So hopefully that's all ratified and sorted by the time the bridging mechanism expires at the end of June, which is kind of the extension period that the EU allowed us to have, whereby we could still process EU personal data until the end of June. In terms of future further negotiation, obviously financial services is still not sorted. They are meant to be reaching a memorandum of understanding by the end of March. There's no white smoke coming from either party yet, so we don't really know where that is at. Services trade has been left in many respects high and dry. There was so much focus on import and export of goods, both in the media, both in the negotiations and everything, and services have been very much left underwhelmed, let's say, by the trade and cooperation agreement. Those conformity assessments, there's no agreement on the mutual recognition of most conformity assessments that mean that manufacturers in the UK, not only just in food and drink, are going to have their products assessed for compliance by different notified bodies, if you like. Obviously, we talked about the burdens of sanitary and phytosanitary measures that are having on your sector in particular. Trade remedies, so I did allude to those earlier on a little bit. So we do have protection against, there's protection in the trading cooperation agreement anyway. It would dramatically impact the level playing field if all of a sudden the EU started to import goods into the UK that were cheaper than our domestic manufacturers could match. But you know, that's not really going to happen. But if it did, on the worst case scenario, we can impose things like anti-dumping duties and so on. If we treat effectively the EU as a third country in that respect, and we can impose those anti-dumping duties on goods coming from India and Pakistan and so on. So why wouldn't we do it to the EU as well? And data adequacy we've talked about. So, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I've taken up more than an hour of your life, and it's time you'll never get back, and we've rushed through it. But I have given you a number of links there, just that you might be aware of or you might not be aware of. And also, I'll make sure that you get a copy of these slides so you've got my contact details. But I suppose at this point, it would just be really good if anybody does have any questions, if they wanted to unmute themselves. Paul and myself would be very happy to take them. Does anybody have any questions? I've either put you all to sleep, which is quite possible.
Don't be shy, folks.
Paul, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I just one question really. I think there was a question about VAT in country, and whether there's anything you can say on that, or people to talk to in terms of where to go to get help on reclaiming VAT in country and taxes.
So you mean if you are, say for example, exporting delivered duty paid,
yeah,
so you're paying the import, yeah. So we've had that recently with one of your clients. It's really contacting the local customs authority to understand what the process is for registering locally for VAT in that market. And then depending on the complexity of what they send you through, seeking the advice of an accountant potentially. I mean, it is a little bit complicated in so much as countries like France and France and Ireland aren't insisting on fiscal representation for UK companies looking to register for VAT, but other markets are. So some 19 of them are insisting that if UK companies want to register in their market for VAT, then they have to have fiscal representation. And obviously that comes at an extra cost, because for anybody that's not aware, a fiscal representative is somebody that kind of shares some of the burden of the outstanding VAT, or the outstanding liability, and in return for that you pay them kind of a security or a bond or something. So if you don't pay that and they have to, they're covered. So it has an additional cost and it's more bureaucracy really. Ireland, obviously, that we talked about earlier, doesn't insist on that, and France doesn't, and there's a couple of others that still don't, but it seems to be the way that the EU's going. Yeah. Anything else, anyone?
Is there anything you can say in terms of feeds? Because I think people were asking about it, and I think it's specific really to plants and food, and obviously then for things that are seed related and certain other goods, then feeds doesn't apply. Isn't that correct?
I think so. It's not my area of expertise,
Yeah.
but I could certainly look into it for anybody that, you know, needed advice, or I could work with you on it, Paul.
Yeah. So just in case, for anybody who's thinking of exporting, so like flowers and fruit and veg, definitely feeds apply. But I think for things such as bulbs and seeds, it doesn't. So you still need a phyto. So it can take about 7 days to get a phyto if you need one.
Yeah.
So the other thing too is when you're having an inspection, for anybody who hasn't done it yet and is about to go through it, you know, you will need to make sure the goods are finished and packed. They won't look at stuff that's about to be packed. It's got to be the final article.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
So the big problem has been that goods that are, you know, just-in-time sales. So a lot of the just-in-time orders have gone by the wayside because of the plant inspection requirement.
Oh, it's good fun, isn't it?
Not.
No, it's not great. If there's no more questions from anyone, then I mean, we are recording today's session, so please just reach out and let us know if you want a recording. And similarly, I'll PDF the slides, and you're quite welcome to get a copy of those as well. It's a lot to cover off in an hour, and I do apologise that I went well over that, but hopefully you've gotten some takeaways from it.
If there's any questions, please ask us. If I don't know or Andrea doesn't know, we'll find out.
We'll find somebody that does. Yeah, absolutely. That's super, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Paul, thank you as ever. And we'll see some of you on the next one. But thanks again for your time.
Yeah, just to mention as well, folks, there is going to be a webinar. If anybody needs advice on the labour, there will be a webinar on labour on the 29th at 6 p.m. If you need details, just let me know. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Bye.